Hello, listener, and welcome to Book 4, Chapter 1 of Bite-Sized Tales, the audio flash fiction podcast. We kick off this book with bonus chapters as a sequel to Book 3, Chapter 20. If you haven't listened to that chapter, it's highly recommended that you do so, as each story in this chapter of Book 4 deals with the characters established in Book 3, Chapter 20.
The Beginning of the End. Cody. Written and read by Wayne Cole. Cody's eyes hurt as much from crying as the cell phone light that was blinding him. He was hiding curled up as far back on the bottom shelf as he could manage, hoping the woman looting the store wouldn't find him. That was until someone had come around the corner holding a cell phone and shined the light right at him. The scary woman with blood all over her face was right in front of the shelf, holding a knife at the man. As afraid as he was, Cody prepared to run if the opportunity arose. These two adults looked like they might start fighting, just like all the other adults out there. Mama's dead, and it's all my fault, thought Cody. He tried to fight the tears back, afraid that they would give away his hiding spot. He had to be quiet. But that was something that he had always been bad at. It was something Mama always yelled at him about. He was supposed to stay in his room and be quiet when she had visitors over, no matter what he heard. Cody remembered fighting with her the night before. She wanted him to clean his room, but he was watching a video on his iPad. When he told her no, she yelled and sent him to his room. He was so angry. Stomping up the stairs, he turned back and yelled at her, "I hate you! I wish you were dead!" That was the last thing he ever said to Mama, and he wanted, more than anything, that he could take it back. He hadn't really meant it. He just wanted her to know how mad he was. Out of all the things he had wished for in his life, why was that the one that came true? Mama must have woken up before him in the morning, because he heard her in the kitchen yelling at someone. She was saying lots of bad words, so they must have made her very mad. Cody hardly ever heard her say words like that, and she spanked him if he did. A man's voice was yelling back at her, and then came the most horrible sound he had ever heard. Mama screamed in pain. Cody thought he should go help her, but all the angry yelling had scared him. He also knew when Mama had a visitor, he stayed in his room. She was already angry, and he didn't want to make her even angrier. When Cody heard the front door slam shut, he came out of his room. Mama might be hurt and need an ice pack. Sometimes that happened when she had a visitor. He went down the stairs slowly, looking around to make sure it was the stranger that had left, and not Mama. The kitchen was a mess, and the cabinets open, things all over the place. He saw Mama and wondered why she was laying on the floor. Then he noticed the blood oozing out from under her, and the knife. "Mama?" he asked, but she didn't say anything back. He took a few steps towards her and asked again, "Mama, are you okay?" He reached down and, straining with all his strength, tried to turn her over. She finally flopped over onto her back. Through the cuts in her shirt, he could see that some of her insides were now on the outside of her body. He couldn't really remember what happened for a while after that. There was screaming and crying, but no one came to help. Cody didn't know where to go for help. The only place close by he knew how to walk to was the dollar store that Mama worked at sometimes. She always complained that they didn't give her enough hours to pay the rent. Her boss there was mean, but the other ladies were nice. There was more yelling and gunshots outside, so he decided he'd be sneaky and try to avoid any adults he didn't know. That was easy to do going through the old overgrown park that Mama always said was too dangerous for him to play in. Behind the dollar store, Cody saw that Miss Jamie's car was in the employee parking lot. She was his favorite, because she always had candy in her purse that she would give him. Forgetting that he was trying to be sneaky, he ran from the bush he was hiding in right up to the back door. It was unlocked, but the back room was dark. He tried to turn the lights on, but nothing happened when he flicked the switch. Even through the darkness, it was obvious that the store was a mess. Besides the floors being cluttered, a jar of pickles had shattered near the stockroom door. Cody slipped on the pickle juice in the dark and fell. He screamed and cried in pain as his hand hit something on the floor. When his eyes finally adjusted, he could see a large sliver of glass from the jar sticking out of it. The juices burned, making the cut hurt even more. With a hiss of pain, Cody pulled the glass out of his palm and dropped it to the ground. The blood made him think of Mama. Cody searched around the dark, finally finding a single box of Band-Aids that had not been taken. The medicine aisle was so empty, it reminded him of the toy aisle the week after Christmas. He knew he should wash his hands before using the Band-Aid, but couldn't remember where the bathroom was. Instead, he wiped his palm on his shirt to dry it and put on the biggest Band-Aid in the box. It still hurt a lot. Car lights shone through the front window as an SUV pulled into the parking lot. Cody ran to the front door to see who it was, hoping that they could help him. The woman who got out of the SUV had a face covered in blood. She was a mess and reminded Cody of Mama's friend Cindy after she had taken too many pills. Mama had called her a junkie and yelled at her for using her own product. At that moment, he decided it would be best if this woman didn't know he was there. Running down the aisles, Cody found what he thought was a perfect place to hide. He slid onto the shelf and pulled the boxes in front of him. He was scared, his hand hurt, and he realized in that moment that he also needed to pee. Cody had plenty of experience hiding from adults, and he knew he could stay quiet if he really needed to. That's exactly what he did as she went through the store gathering supplies. He saw the light from her cell phone in the aisle and just knew that she was going to find him. That was when someone else came into the store. "Hey, I'm just here looking to get some food. I only want enough for a day, maybe 2, and the rest can be yours. Can we make a deal here?" He heard the man from the next aisle. He turned the corner, and Cody could see he was using his phone for light as well. "Just stay there," the woman shouted at him. He could see in the man's light that she held a knife in her hand. That was when the man's light blinded him for a moment. Had the man seen him? He could feel the warmth in his pants, as he couldn't hold the pee back any longer. He hadn't had an accident since that time in kindergarten, and embarrassment joined the fear and the guilt that were overwhelming him. "Oh shit," he heard the man mutter as he tried to hold himself together. He wanted his mama, but he had wished her to be dead, and it happened. There, curled up in a pool of his own pee, he couldn't hold it together any longer. Cody wailed, the tears that only a child who had lost everything could. And now a word from our author. I really loved Chris's story last season and the whole idea behind it. I'm a sucker for a good post-apocalyptic story or a currently apocalyptic story. When he made the suggestion of us writing the next parts of that story, I jumped at the idea. When I actually sat down to write it, though, I found myself struggling. I couldn't decide what perspective to write it in. I wanted it to be extremely hard-hitting, but I also struggled with being the voice of a small child. I felt limited if I told it from first-person perspective, but I wanted to get inside his head as well. In the end, I decided to try to mirror the perspective that Chris used in his story. What came out is probably the darkest story that I have ever written to release. I'm sure it's not the darkest thing I've ever written, but it is by far the darkest that I've written with the idea that someone else would read or hear it.
The Beginning of the End. Tessa. Written and read by Dot Moore. Sirens wailed and pierced through the chaos of downtown. It was easy for Tessa to tune out the noise after the day she'd survived. Nothing could make it any worse. Ultimately, it seemed like a normal Friday rush hour, but Tessa was keenly aware of the unsettling stillness of everyone around her. Throughout her time as a paramedic, she was trained on the fight, flight, or freeze response. What was happening to the masses around her was an amalgamation of all three, though most people stood in place, statuesque, as the trauma washed over them. Tessa jogged through the crosswalk as a sedan went speeding behind her, nearly hitting another person going east out of the city. She was anxiously awaiting a call-in from dispatch, but never received it. She opted to not tempt fate and worked her way up a few blocks to the parking garage. Fortunately, Tessa found a spot on the second floor before her shift this morning, because it was now packed with people trying to get out. After a half hour of fighting to get through the garage, Tessa realized she should have filled up her SUV this morning instead of waiting until after work. She'd have to get gas at one of the stations on the outskirts of the city. No time to run back to her apartment either. The go bag and the covered crate in her trunk would have to suffice for now. Traffic was just as intense as everyone tried to evacuate the city. Tessa's hands gripped the steering wheel as she maneuvered her SUV through the snarling traffic, her eyes darting from side to side, scanning the chaos. The radio was silent. Dispatch still hadn't called, and she hadn't heard a single emergency broadcast. The usual rhythm of the city, the honking, the shouting, the sirens, were replaced with a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the sounds of engines idling in the heat. She passed the on-ramp to the highway, the sign for the outer loop barely visible through the thickening smoke that hung in the air. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just a disaster. This wasn't an accident. People weren't fleeing because of a flood or an earthquake or a terrorist attack. This was different. Tessa pulled onto a side street, narrowly avoiding a crashed car, and slammed on the brakes as she reached the intersection. A figure stepped into the middle of the road. It was a man, his face set in an intense expression. He didn't flinch as she nearly hit him. Tessa's forearms tensed as she gripped the steering wheel. The man's gaze slowly shifted towards her, and for the briefest moment Tessa thought she saw something there. Something familiar. He stood broad-shouldered like an immovable object in the middle of the road, challenging the next sign of life to approach him. Tessa's heart pounded in her chest. She hesitated, unsure of what to do. Her instincts screamed at her to just keep driving, but something held her back. She slowly lifted her hands off the wheel and placed them upright, palms forward, showing the man she didn't have anything. She pointed towards the inside of her door, indicating she was opening it. By the time she looked away to open the door, she caught a brief glimpse from her periphery as he bolted towards her. There was just enough time for him to wedge his fingers along the edge of the door. Tessa held with all her might, but he was stronger. And in a moment of clarity, she knew this man would kill her if he didn't get what he wanted. She let go. He yanked her out of the car by her wrists and threw her on the ground with a swift kick to her gut that knocked the wind out of her. She coughed and moved to her hands and knees and slowly stood to face him. He was waiting for her to make a move, and in an effort to go for the door of her truck, he swooped and tucked his hand behind her neck. The last thing Tessa remembered was the cracking sound of her head slamming against the driver's side window. Tessa wasn't quite sure how much time had passed, but the sun was low enough in the sky to know it had at least been an hour or two. Her head pounded, and instinctively she reached up and felt her hairline. When she pulled her hand away, her fingertips dripped with deep red blood. Tessa sighed. Damn it. She quickly assessed herself physically and mentally. The SUV was gone, so that sucked, but she was at least conscious. The head laceration from the window would probably need stitches. She needed a pharmacy or supplies of some kind at a minimum. Tessa stood slowly in the middle of the road and oriented herself. She remembered there was a dollar store not too far from here and started heading that direction. The walk itself was peaceful, which gave Tessa time to reevaluate her current predicament. Okay, Tess. You've walked farther than this before. She went through the interaction over and over again. So many times she started to blur the reality of what happened. It took a moment for her to shake off the fears of how much worse it could have been. She made it about a mile up the road before she found another car, an older model sedan. She tried the handle, and whatever karmatic recompense she was deserved started to reveal itself when the door opened and the keys were left in the ignition. She sat and tried starting the car, and the engine sputtered to life. Better than nothing, she whispered to herself, and she limped the car down the road. Within a quick 15-minute drive, the strip mall with the dollar store came into view. There were more cars abandoned on the side of the road and in the parking lot. It seemed like the entire world just stopped. Tessa approached the door to the dollar store and crept inside. She was lucky the doors were left unlocked, and better yet that the store wasn't entirely looted already. She moseyed up and down a few of the aisles before finding a backpack and began stuffing it with necessities. Tessa paused when she passed the pharmaceutical aisle and began rifling through, making sure to grab gauze, medical tape, and antibacterial ointment. It would have to do for now. She moved along the back of the store towards the kitchen and cutlery and paused. Tessa was not one for violence, but given her recent experience, self-defense shouldn't be foregone. She found a cheap-handled chef's knife and shook her head in frustration. She almost set it back down, but the unmistakable sound of the door swishing open had her gripping the handle firmly. No time to cower in fear. She was long past that and needed to be strong. She moved silently through the store, only to walk out directly in front of the same man that assaulted her earlier today. She froze, tightening her grip on the knife. "Just stay there!" Author's note. So after Wayne and I listened and read and, went through Chris's original story, we came up with the idea that for the Chapter 1 opener for Book 4, we wanted to do somewhat of a continuation of that story by giving the perspective of the woman and the child from the original perspective that Dan shares in the first part. It worked out well that I was comfortable writing the part of the woman and Wayne wanted to write the child's perspective. I think that we both did a really great job of trying to capture our own individual characters while still leaning into the story that Chris had kind of mapped out for us, and I hope you do as well. Thanks.
The Beginning of the End, Dan, Part 2. Written and read by Chris Hussey. "Oh, shit is right, you son of a bitch," the woman shot back, anger and menace lacing her words. Dan held up both hands in a half gesture of surrender. "I'm sorry, really. I didn't even know what I was doing. I don't give a shit what you were doing. Just stay back." She thrust the knife in her hand in the air towards Dan. He responded by keeping his position and doing his best to soften his face. The last thing he wanted right now was a fight. "Lady, if I had any idea you had a kid with you, I swear I wouldn't have done what I did." Dan felt himself half lying with the response. He wanted to believe what he was saying, but he wasn't sure if he could. He didn't have time to engage in the internal debate because the next thing the woman said caught him off guard. "What kid? I don't have a kid." Dan's face held no allusion to his confusion. "Then who the hell is that?" He gestured towards the small child huddled desperately on the shelf, boxes of dryer sheets and powdered laundry soap doing their best, but failing, to conceal. The woman allowed herself a quick look. Dan knew immediately she had no idea the kid was there. She pivoted away from the kid and slid away, putting her back up against the opposite shelf. "Who the hell are you?" Her words were harsh. The child didn't answer. Dan decided to step in. "Hey, kid, it's okay. She didn't know you were there, and I'm not going to hurt you." He looked toward the woman. She responded with her own quick look. Dan was certain he saw a hint of worry in her eyes. "And I don't think she will either." The woman joined in. Yeah, it's okay, buddy. What are you doing there?" A moment of silence floated between all three before the child spoke. "I peed myself." Dan looked at the woman. She returned his gaze. Both their faces softened simultaneously. She broke the silence. "Oh, no. It's okay, buddy." She duck-walked back to her original position. "Hey, really, it's okay. My name is Tessa. What's yours?" Lowering her device and the knife, she carefully pulled away the boxes that were concealing the child. Dan aided by shining the light from his device. Gently, Tessa reached out for the child. Her tone was soft and reassuring, standing in stark contrast to the dried blood on her face. "Okay, let's get you out. What's your name, buddy?" "Cody," the boy rasped. "Okay," Tessa spoke as she helped Cody out of the shelf to stand. Dan stood with the pair and smiled at Cody. "I'm Dan." As Dan moved about the store, filling his own basket with what few supplies remained, he felt he was living on borrowed time. He and Tessa worked together to help Cody get his pants clean. Then Tessa expertly cleaned and rebandaged a nasty wound on Cody's hand. Both efforts went a long way to reassure the young boy that he was as safe as he could be with two strangers in the circumstances they found themselves. Cody seemed to accept that idea quicker than Dan expected. The boy said something about his mom and many strangers, but wasn't forthcoming about anything more regarding his mother. The looks Dan exchanged with Tessa about the subject showed they both agreed that the fate of the boy's mother likely wasn't good, but neither was going to press the issue. While Dan found himself worried about Cody, he was more worried about Tessa and their unfinished business. He'd assaulted her and left her for dead, and here she was. Dan knew revenge would be coming. It had to be. For now, though, while Cody amused himself with opening all the remaining toys to find ones he liked, and also being given permission to open them without repercussion, Dan and Tessa secured supplies. He heard her rummaging one aisle over, the light from her mobile device bouncing up and down. If he was going to make amends, it was now or never. He was about to speak when Tessa's voice jumped in front of him. "So? What do you think?" Dan was surprised by her words, but decided to answer. His apology would have to wait. "About what happened?" "No." Dan heard Tessa batting around tiny boxes on a shelf, searching for treasure, while she spoke. "I don't care what happened. Well, scratch that. I do. No, I want to know what you think we should do right now." Tessa's light gestured vaguely toward the entrance of the store. "It's going to be dark in about an hour. We need to decide what we're going to do." Dan cocked his head in surprise. "We?" Tessa continued to scavenge. "Yes, we. Look, Dan, right now we're better as a group than by ourselves. Plus there's a kid with us who's probably an orphan now." Dan could hear that she was moving down the aisle, so he followed from his side. "I don't know what the hell we're going to do about that, but there's no way I'm abandoning him, so we'll worry about that later." Tessa stopped once again and resumed her foraging. "On top of that, the way I figure it, if you wanted to, you would have taken off already. You haven't, so that means you're at least halfway decent, despite—" Her words trailed off. Dan felt the guilt hit his stomach hard. "Tessa," was all he could muster. He moved towards the end of the aisle, forcing words forward. Tessa rounded to his side and locked eyes with him. "Besides, in that moment, when you stepped in front of my SUV, before I got out like a goddamn fool..." Dan saw her eyes begin to water. "I almost hit the gas instead of the brake." Tessa's words came out choked. The pair stood in silence for a moment, both in their personal guilt. Dan slowly nodded. "Understood," he whispered. "Yeah," Tessa responded. Dan was struggling to stay awake. He and Tessa decided to stay the night in the store, building a makeshift bedroom in the back storeroom, with boxes and other items for ad hoc walls and bedding. The setup served a dual purpose, allowing the trio to stay hidden. Dan hoped it wouldn't be necessary, but he'd also taken the time to set a few noise traps for extra security at the front entrance. Their interior campsite was near the back door, which they made sure was locked. Outside that door, the pair cleared the space, making sure if they had to make a quick exit, nothing would be able to easily sneak up on them. His eyes were heavy, only 2 hours into his watch shift with 2 more to go. Dan passed the time checking his phone for anything. News updates, texts from friends, social media posts, anything to give some sort of clue as to what happened, and more importantly, what was happening. There was nothing to be learned. No coverage. It didn't matter where he stood or walked within the store. No bars could be found. That left Dan to the various theories he'd mused about earlier to continue to play in his head. Worry for his friends also held a loud voice. He didn't even want to think about his family, his siblings, and his mother. All he could do was offer a few silent prayers that all were okay, or at least weren't experiencing what he was. The breaking of glass and clanking of cans snapped Dan to attention. One of the traps was sprung. Someone was here. He turned toward Tessa, whose eyes were already open. She hadn't moved, but her knife was gripped tightly in her hand. She whispered, "Was that?" Dan nodded and carefully stood. He moved out of the enclosure towards the doors that led towards the store's interior. He could hear Tessa rousing Cody. A few grunts from the kid were met with shushes from her. Crouching by the door, Dan placed his ear close, but making sure to not press against the latchless doors. Then he heard the voices. He tried counting, but couldn't make out more than 2, their whispers masking their true numbers. Bent over, he scooted back towards Tessa. "How many?" she whispered. Dan's face stayed serious while he shrugged a non-conforming answer. "At least 2, but probably more." Dan kept his voice low. Cody picked up their tension. "What's happening? Is someone here to hurt us? What are we going to do?" Tessa put a hand on his shoulder. "We don't know, but we have to be careful." She looked back at Dan, and with a jerk of her head towards the door, her intention was clear. They should leave. Dan nodded in agreement. The trio secured their backpacks and bags containing their supplies. In the dim light through high windows, they moved toward the back door. The voices from the store's front changed from whispers to a shout. "Anyone home?" Dan felt a pang of panic hit his gut at the sound. Snapping his head, he saw the flickering of flashlights through the doors. They were getting close. Then his eyes darted to a box on a storage shelf. The top of the box was removed, and the label on the outside confirmed what Dan thought he saw inside the box. Maps. He heard Tessa whisper shout by the door. "Dan, let's go." He gave her a quick look to see her frantic gestures while she gripped the handle. Cody's face, though mostly in shadow, revealed his growing fear. "Hey, you two check the back. We've got this," came the shout from the store's front. Dan moved quickly and dug his hand into the box, grabbing as many of the maps he could hold, with no idea what he was even grabbing. As he pulled away, his hand didn't clear the top, and he knocked the box to the floor. It hit the concrete with a loud slap and skid as the contents spilled. "What was that?" came a voice at the doors while Dan heard himself curse. The back door clicked open, and Dan ran towards the opening, following after Tessa and Cody. He didn't look back. "There it is." Dan pointed in the moonlight towards the SUV that was stalled on the road. Tessa nodded. She recognized it. Memories of the pain she suffered at Dan's hands flashed in her mind. "Let's hope the fob is still in there." "And that it charged enough," Dan added. "We're taking that?" Cody asked. "Whose is it?" A silence fell between Dan and Tessa that she finally answered. "Ours." The trio reached the vehicle and quickly hopped in, securing their gear. Dan breathed a welcome sigh as he pulled the fob and a note off the dash. Taking a moment, he unfolded the note he wrote, never thinking he'd be sending it to himself. As he started the SUV, he read it. "Hopefully, this will be charged. Take it. I hope it gets you to safety. Whatever has happened, I hope you don't forget to trust and remember your humanity. Good luck." "Let's go," Tessa urged. Dan looked at her and smiled. She returned the expression. The pair looked back towards Cody, who was finishing the buckle on his seatbelt. He shot the pair a thumbs up. With a chuckle, Dan threw the SUV into gear, and the trio drove off into the dark. Author's note. So we came up with this idea of deciding to start book 4 with a perspective from all the other characters as far as what led them up to that moment, and then I would take over Dan for the last part in continuing moving the story forward. And it wasn't something that was initially planned, but after that story was written, we kind of came up with the idea that maybe this might be kind of a fun thing to do, just to see how everyone got there. Inspired a little bit, I would imagine, maybe by the TV show Black Summer, which you can find on Netflix. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed the story. I'm very curious to know what their fate might be, and I hope that you are as well. Thanks for listening. This chapter of Bite-Sized Tales has been brought to you under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Intro and outro music is Fantasy Motion by Alexander Nakarada, provided under a Creative Commons 4.0 license. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, we greatly appreciate reviews and recommendations to your friends. For more information about our authors, visit bitesizedtales.com or follow us on Instagram at bite_size_tales. We look forward to reading to you next time.